everybody, my name is Armin. I'm here today to give a brief practical tutorial on reproducible modeling. And for this tutorial, I will use a toy example, which is a very typical dataset, which is the handwritten digits dataset. In this case, not MNIST, but from the scikit-learn library, which consists of these individual images, which each depict a handwritten digit. And one example pipeline, computational modeling pipeline for this kind of dataset could be that we try to train any kind of predictive model to identify which digit is depicted on each image. So we have a model that in the end tells us, okay, for this image, for example, this depicts a 4. And what we would typically do in order to enable our predictive model to do this is we would fit this model. For example, in a gradient descent way, where we optimize or minimize some loss function here as a function of the model's parameters. And this is, I think this kind of pipeline is what I will be talking about when I say computational modeling. Even though everything I will be talking about is kind of tied to these kinds of machine learning examples, I hope that it will still give people from other backgrounds also a good intuition of how to think about making their analysis pipelines and their computational modeling approaches reproducible. There are two aspects of reproducible modeling that I would like to focus on today. One is something that is called inference reproducibility, which focuses on improving the ability of others or enabling others to be able to independently draw similar qualitative conclusions from the application of your analysis strategy to new data, for example, or by independently reanalyzing your own data. And then in the second part of my talk, I will be focusing on computational reproducibility, which focuses more on how can you enable others to obtain the exact same numerical results from applying your code to your data. I will start off talking a bit about the role of hyperparameters, what role hyperparameters play in a typical modeling pipeline, and how you can handle hyperparameters to improve the inference reproducibility of your analysis. And then in the second part of this first section of my talk, I will talk a bit about things you can do to reduce test error, or more generally to improve model estimates, so that they generalize better to other data sets, other scenarios, so that any inferences from your analyses are better reproducible, even in new data. Okay, and then I will talk a bit about randomness in computational programs and the role of randomness for making things reproducible, both on the inference reproducibility side, but also on the computational reproducibility side. And then in the second part of my talk, I will talk more generally about how you organize any kind of computational project to make it usable by others. This includes organizing your directory structure, but also making your script and your code understandable for others, maybe automating your analysis, and then sharing your code with Git and GitHub. So the second part of my talk is going to be more detached from machine learning and more general, I think, also for other fields. But again, I also hope that in the first part of my talk, people from other backgrounds will get a good intuition for the kind of aspects you need to think about when trying to make your modeling reproducible. So first off, I want to talk a bit about hyperparameters. So hyperparameters can be understood as any kind of values that control the fitting of your model, the training process of your model. And in our example, when we think back about how we would fit a model, for example, to our handwritten digit data set, one very common algorithm for optimizing these kind of problems is something called gradient descent, or stochastic gradient descent, which on a very high level proceeds as follows. You have some loss function here shown in red, and you have your model weights. You start off with some random initializations of your weights, and then you try to find the weights that minimize the loss function. And this happens typically in an iterative way. So you start off at a point, you update your weights, and then you update them in sequence, so multiple times, until you reach a point where you think, okay, this might be an optimum of my loss function. So here I have the minimum in my loss given a certain set of weights. And this algorithm on a high level has multiple hyperparameters, 3 of them that I quickly want to introduce because I will be using them throughout my talk. The first one is the learning rate. The learning rate scales the size of our weight updates. So the higher the learning rate, the larger the steps we take, the larger the updates of our weights, the larger the steps we take on the loss function. So you see it here, the learning rate would determine whether we go from the initial point to the first or to the second, for example. It scales how large these steps are. In the equation below, you also see it indicated by eta. The second parameter is, for example, the strength of regularization. So regularization is something you apply in many computational modeling pipelines where you fit a model to data to prevent overfitting. And regularization can, for example, be applied in a way where you penalize larger weights. So you try to nudge the optimization algorithm in a way such that it prefers smaller weights over larger weights by adding a penalty term to your loss, which simply can be the sum of your squared weights, for example, parameter weights. And then the regularization strength here in the equation be indicated by alpha. So again, a simple scaling parameter. And a third and last parameter that I will be using in my analysis or in my example is the number of gradient descent steps that you're doing. So depending on how many steps you're doing, you will end up on different locations in your loss function. And there might be a certain number of steps that are too little, where you have not reached your minimum of your loss function yet. As in this case, for example, where you only do 3 steps, 6 might be optimal, and 9 might be too many. And it's just important to have an idea of what these parameters do on a high level, not necessarily the details. Because what I want to demonstrate is that these high parameters, depending on how you choose them, your model will perform differently well in your classification task. So what you see here on the right is a plot that I created, which I will be talking more about later in my presentation, which depicts the variance in the classifications and the classifier's accuracy of our example. So how well our classifier is able to identify the handwritten digits from the individual images when varying each of these hyperparameters individually. So in the first panel on the top right in blue, you see the variance in the model's accuracy if I hold all of the hyperparameters that are depicted otherwise constant, so a constant learning rate, a constant number of steps, and I only vary the strength of regularization. We see this is the variance in the model's predictive performance or estimate accuracy that would result from varying only this parameter. We see that all of these parameters have a meaningful effect on the model's final performance, up to, I think, 10 percentage points difference in accuracy. So what people usually do in order to fit these hyperparameters in their pipeline is they perform some sort of hyperparameter optimization. This basically means nothing else than testing different combinations of hyperparameters and then choosing the one that kind of performs best in your data set. And these are the hyperparameters that people then report often and use for their models. And it's important to be aware of that why this is all a good and important process of optimizing your model. It's important that if you want to enable other people to reproduce your analyses in new data, it's very important that you are as transparent as possible about how you evaluate hyperparameters, which choices you made, which criterion you used to select final hyperparameters for your model, and, for example, how well your model performed for each combination of hyperparameters. This can be done, for example, by reporting the results in a table like this, where you actually list for each run where you fitted the model. So each time you optimize the model, you list the hyperparameters and the resulting accuracies, or whatever criterion you use to choose your model. Yeah, so it's key to be as transparent about this process as possible. The goal of any kind of, or of many computational modeling projects, especially machine learning, is that you provide some estimate of how well your model will perform in new data. This is called our test estimate. And we are trying to do this in a way such that the test error, so how well our model will also perform in other new data, is as little as possible. So that the difference between how well it performs in our data and new data is as small as possible. And conventionally, the most basic form of estimating test error is by taking your data set, which is here depicted in gray. Each bar represents one sample. You split it in training and testing data, such that samples are either such that each sample can be in only the training data or the test data, so there's no overlap. You train your model with the training data set, and then use the test data set to evaluate the performance of your predictive model. In this case, you would say, okay, maybe a model with 85% accuracy is able to identify the handwritten digits from the test data. So we assume that our model has a performance of 85%. What happens in most cases, though, is then you show the model actually a new data set and your performance is different. And this difference is what I here mean with the test error. And there are a lot of factors to drive magnitude of test error, but there's one, I think, which is very universal and which is, I think, important to be aware of, which I would like to talk about today. And that is your estimate of how well your model performs in your data strongly depends on how you split your data. Let's take an example. Let's say this is your data set and you're trying to distinguish or separate blue and red dots. Each dot has two features, x1, x2. You randomly say, okay, these 4 dots are my test data set, so I remove them from the data set. And this is my training data, and I fit a model. I see the model does a perfect job of separating blue and red dots. And then, okay, I show the model my test data set. And again, the model performs perfectly, 100% accuracy in separating blue and red dots. Now let's use the same scenario, the exact same data, and let's choose another 4 dots randomly. Let's say these 4. Again, we fit our model to the training data. The model perfectly separates blue and red dots. But when we show it the test data, we see that the model actually has not learned a good function to separate the 2 model classes. So we see in this case how well, or like the performance of our model, our estimate of the model's performance is strongly dependent on how we split the same data set between training and test. So what you can often do, and what is often recommended in machine learning, is that you do something like cross-validation, which means that you don't just fit your model once to one single split of the data and then you evaluate it on the test data set, but that you do this multiple times. And you create multiple splits of your data such that each sample is once in a test data set. In this case, here we would create 3 folds or 3 splits of our data set. Each time we use the full data set and we split it in a test set and a training data set. In this case, because it's 3-fold cross-validation, 3 folds, we would dedicate 1/3 of the data for testing and 2/3 for training. And then we repeatedly, or we iteratively fit our model to each split of the data, each fold, and we record its model performance and its predictive performance. And we see that performance varies. It might be 85 in the first fold, then 83, then 90. And so we see, depending on how we separate the data, the performance of our model will vary. And by having done this multiple times, we kind of can estimate or account for the variability in our model's performance that is introduced by differently splitting our data. And we can then report some aggregate performance measure over these different folds instead of just reporting a single estimate, which might be biased given how we split the data. And next, I would like to talk a bit about randomness. So in addition to how you split your data set, randomness is an important factor in many computational modeling pipelines, especially in machine learning, but probably also in other fields. And to illustrate what I mean, let's take the example of how you shuffle your data. So back to gradient descent, to our example. We oftentimes gradient descent does not use the full data set at each iteration to update the weights, but instead, especially with large data sets, it uses small batches of the data set, which means that at each iteration, it would not look at the full data set, but only as a subset of this data set. And the subset is called a batch. In the first iteration, for example, it might look at only the first 2 samples, then in the second iteration, the next 2 samples, and so on. And in this scenario, the sequence in which we present the data to our algorithm has an effect on its final performance. So if we would shuffle the data differently before optimization procedure, we would get a different final model performance, a different estimate of the model test error. So even though, a bit of background now, even though these processes seem random, so computers are able to generate sequences that approximate randomness, but even though these sequences of numbers that they generate might seem random at first, they're actually anchored on something that is called a seed. So in the background, you have something running that is called a pseudo random number generator. And these generators, they're typically initialized or anchored on a random seed value. This can be, for example, this is typically a sequence of numbers, of integers. In this case, it would be 2, 3, 6, 8. And This integer then determines the exact sequence of numbers that result from your random number generator. So you would be able to set your seed in your script, and then someone else on another machine can run your same code and obtain the exact same values resulting from your random generation. So the exact same sequence in which your data is shuffled, for example, and then obtain the exact same results. So this is why it is very important that every time you use a process that makes use of randomness or pseudo randomness in a computer, that you set a random seed value in order for other people to be able to obtain the exact same results from this random process. But in addition to this more computational reproducibility aspect of randomness, it's also important to be aware of the fact that depending on how you set your seed, your model will obtain different performance in the end. So there might be one seed that performs particularly well in your analysis pipeline, and you get the maximum accuracy, but a different seed would lead to a much lower accuracy. So you kind of want to account for the effect that this randomness in your pipeline has on your final model performance. So ideally, you would say, okay, I fit my model multiple times, but with randomly initialized seeds, you could have a random number generator for your seeds, for example, which then has an initial starting point, just to get an estimate of how much does this kind of randomness influence your model's performance. Yeah, because this will allow others this will generally improve the inference reproducibility of your work, because it will better account for the specifics of how you computed your model. Okay, so to sum up this first part of my talk, and the second part is going to be a bit longer. What we can do to improve the inference reproducibility of our work is generally being, for example, transparent about the hyperparameter choices that we make, how we evaluate hyperparameters, which settings of hyperparameters we evaluated, and how we chose our final set of hyperparameters. We should account for different ways of splitting the data, for example, with cross-validation, and we should be aware and account for any kind of randomness or pseudo-randomness in our analysis pipeline. Okay, in the second part of my talk, I would like to focus more on the computational aspects of reproducibility. So how can you enable others to use and apply your exact same code to the exact same data to obtain the exact same results? And I will first talk a bit about how you organize your project, then how you can make your code easy to understand and portable so it can run on different machines, how you can automate your analysis, and then how you later on can share and also version control your own code with Git and GitHub. So to do this, I've created a small example of a reproducible modeling project, which you can find under github.com/8thms/reproducible modeling. And it's just a toy example project, but what it does basically is it reproduces this figure which you see here on the right, of which I showed you bits so far in the presentation. So just to summarize again, what you see in this figure is the variance introduced in the performance of a simple classifier, in this case, a linear support vector machine, when identifying individual handwritten digits from the handwritten digits dataset. And so at each fitting run, I basically held all the hyperparameters of the model constant and only varied the one that is depicted. For example, in the top panel, you would see the variance in model performance that results from only varying the regularization strength, but everything else is held constant. And then the same for the learning rate, the number of steps, and then the random state here indicates the random seed for the shuffling process, basically. So you see different random seeds lead to different shuffling, which results in different model performance. So first, a very basic thing, I think, to enable others to reuse your code is that you organize it in a way that is easy to understand and easy to navigate for others. And there are conventions for doing this. You would, for example, have a folder in your directory, which is for the dataset you're using, a data folder. In our case, this has only a single file, which is a copy of the handwritten digits dataset provided by scikit-learn. Then you would have a folder for your results. In our case, our results folder has two subdirectories, because you can also have subdirectories in these directories. One for any estimates that we obtain from our analysis pipeline, and another, for example, for any figures. In our case, again, there would be one file in each of these subdirectories. One for our the accuracies of the model resulting from each fitting run, and another for the figure that I just showed you before. Then you could have a folder for all the scripts that you use in your analysis. So ideally, you create one script for each step, each self-contained step of your analysis. In our case, for example, you could have a script that loads your data, so downloads it from scikit-learn to your directory. Then a script that performs cross-validation with different hyperparameter settings, which is here called evaluate hyperparams performance. And then a script that creates the figure given the results from this evaluation, which is here plot hyperparams effect. And then there's a fourth script in this folder, which allows us to run the entire analysis, which I will talk about later. You could also have a folder in your script in addition, which is called source. And conventionally in a source folder, you would have any kind of modules, packages that you wrote for your analysis pipeline. And just for the purposes of illustration, I created a small toy package, which is called hyper, which is located there, which does nothing else than, for example, sample different hyperparameter values, different regularization strengths and different learning rates, and perform cross-validation in our example data set and does plotting. So it kind of captures all the functionality that we're using in our scripts. And then you would have typically a Readme file. A Readme file is a file that describes how your project is structured and gives introduction into how other people can use your code and data and reproduce your findings. And I will talk a bit more about this in a moment. Typically, you also have a license file in your repository. This is something that is very essential for open science, that you specify how can other people use your code. For coding projects, often the MIT license is recommended, for example, which I use in many of my projects. Okay, so once you've organized your project in some form that you feel comfortable with, how can you make the individual scripts easy to use and understand for other people? Okay, the Readme file first. So the Readme file is meant as an introduction to your repository, and conventionally Readme files are written in Markdown. Markdown is a simple markup language, so it allows you to create formatted or rich text in a relatively simple way. So it looks like this, and I don't want to get into the details of Markdown. You can look this up if you want online. It is often used because GitHub, for example, automatically renders Markdown files. You see that the code that I just showed you results in a relatively nicely organized and structured file. This is a Readme file from the repository that you find in GitHub. In general, a Readme file has a few sections. One of them being that you describe in general what is happening in this repository, what is the purpose of this project. Then you can have a section that describes how is your project organized. Here I created a directory tree, which for each file and directory indicates, okay, what is this file doing, or which kind of files do you find in this directory? And it gives people an overview of like what is happening here, like where are the different parts of this project located. Then you would conventionally have a section that describes how the data is formatted and how the data is structured. So for example, what are the columns and what are the rows? And where's the data from? In my case, I'm only referencing here the scikit-learn library documentation because I'm just pulling the data set from there. And you would also have a section that describes how other people can install all the dependencies and all the software that you're using in your project. I will also talk a bit more about how to do this in a bit. Okay. And lastly, it is also really helpful for others if you include a section in your Readme file that explains how other people can reproduce your analysis. For example, by having a script that reproduces your entire analysis pipeline, and then specifying how the script can be run. Again, a bit more about this later. Now, how do you make individual scripts of your directory that reproduce individual analysis steps? How do you make them easy to understand for others? I generally recommend that people start out any script with a brief description of what's happening in the script. You could, so these are the first few lines of your script. You could have a section that says, okay, what is the purpose of the script? What is it doing? very similar to the description of the repository, just in this case, only for this single analysis step. Then briefly describe what are the inputs for the script and what are the outputs. And then you can also include information about who authored the script. Next, I typically recommend that you follow, or I try to follow this as often as possible, is the pseudocode programming paradigm, where instead of starting to immediately write code, I write the individual analysis steps of my script in plain language. So I just sit there and I think about, okay, what is happening when, and I just write it in plain text. On the one hand side, this helps you think through, okay, how do you structure your analysis actually? Because often when you think about the details, problems come up and it's good to think about them as early as possible. On the other hand, it immediately provides you with good documentation for your code. So you can, once you've written down individual analysis steps, here, for example, loading the data set first, then defining a classification model, defining hyperparameters, and then evaluating the classifier's performance. Once you've written these things down, you can just start writing code around these comments. And you have immediately provided good documentation of your code because someone else can just go look in your script and without understanding individual comments, have an idea of what is happening at each part in each section of your script. Another thing that I generally recommend is to stick to naming conventions for whatever programming language you use. So here I'm using Python and my examples are in Python, but these kind of conventions also exist for other languages. For Python, PEP8 is a very common style guide, but Google also provides their own style guides for all kinds of languages. So if you use a different language and you are interested in those style guides, you can check them out at google.github.io/style guide. But you can also find a documentation of PEP8 online. And these guides are relatively exhaustive, but I just want to cover a few bits of these guides to give you an intuition of what kind of things do these guides specify. PEP8, for example, says that all the variables and modules that you use in your script should be written in snake case. Snake case means that the individual words that make up your variable name are written in lowercase and separated by an underscore. Whereas classes are written in camel case. Camel case means that the individual words that make up your class name are not separated and they start with capital letters. In this case, we would have the SGD classifier, which we're using in our analyses, which is the stochastic gradient descent classifier from scikit-learn. And sorry. Another thing that a style guide as pip specifies is that you should indent with 4 spaces. Importantly, you don't necessarily need to actually type these kind of indentations by yourself because most modern text editors can transform indents to whatever format you want. Just be sure that you set it once in your text editor and set it to whatever you prefer. In my case, I use Visual Studio Code, and Visual Studio Code can transform my tabs to 4 spaces, or 2 if you want to be more efficient. Okay. Another thing that you should do is anytime you write a function or a class, you should briefly write a documentation of what is this function doing in the form of a doc string. So a doc string is a documentation string that is put at the beginning of your function, which is really a string that is wrapped in triplets of quotation marks. And this string is generally composed of, of the following section. So it has a brief description of what is the purpose of this function, what is this function computing. You can have here individual analysis steps of your function. Then it defines the inputs of your function. So what arguments do you need to apply to this function? This specification should generally include the individual data types of these arguments and information about how these data types should be, what they represent and how they should be structured, the arguments or the inputs. And then it should provide some information about what does this function return. So what is the output of this function? So once you've documented your code well, and you have the feeling your code is understandable for others, what can you do to make it portable? Portable means here that other people can run it on their machines. So what can you do to allow someone else to use your code install your dependencies and actually run it. So one thing you should never do is use absolute paths. So this is an example of an absolute path. Here I'm specifying the directory of our data folder in Reproducible Modeling project, my example project. And you see that the path goes from home, users, Thomas, projects, Reproducible Modeling to data. And this is a path that is very specific to my computer, that is certainly going to break on most other people's computer or machines. And when writing code that is supposed to be used by others, you need to be aware of the fact that, or you should be aware of the fact that the only thing you can be certain of when someone reuses your code is where files are located in your project directory. So in the folder that you actually give to someone else, which they put in their machine. And to do this, you can use relative paths, so paths that indicate the location of files or folders relative to the location of a script, for example. In this case, I could specify the location of my data folder relative to my script folder, which means I would leave the script folder, go one level up in the directory, here indicated by ... and then from there go into the dash and the data directory. Because I know for sure if someone else uses my code, my scripts and data directory are going to be in the same location relative to one another as on my machine, even though the whole folder by itself might be somewhere entirely different on this machine, on the other person's machine. So always use relative paths, never use absolute paths. Another thing that you need to be aware of is that the software that you're using when you write code might change over time. So you typically don't write all the code yourself for your project, but you use libraries that are openly available, openly open source if you want other people to be able to use your code. And the arguments, or this code might change, these versions of the software. So input arguments might change, or function names might change, and then someone else might install the right version, the right software, but in the wrong version, and your code might break because something just doesn't fit anymore. So to do this, what you want to do is you want, on the one hand side, create some sort of virtual environment in which you run your own code, which a virtual environment is nothing else than some isolated directory on your computer that computes, for example, a specific version of Python and all the specific versions of the packages that you're using in your analysis. And then these are the only packages and the only software that you use to compute your analysis. And you want someone else to be able to reproduce this environment as closely as possible in order to run your code. And there are different packages in Python that allow you to manage these kind of virtual environments. There's pipenv, there's Anaconda, which is really well known. And more recently, there's Python Poetry also. And I think because Python Poetry is something more recent and maybe many people are not that familiar with it, I will talk about this because I think Anaconda is often, or pipenv is like, well, comparably well known. So I will just briefly go through how you set up a Python Poetry project and how you share it with other people so they can reproduce your virtual environment. What you see here is kind of my simulated terminal. So I just took screenshots of a terminal. And the first thing you want to do is you want to activate your Python environment that you want to use for your project. In this case, I'm using Python 3.9.5, and I'm using pyenv, which I can highly recommend for Python version management. In this environment, I would then go to whatever directory I want to use for my project, and I would simply type poetry in it after installing Python Poetry. The Python Poetry website has, which is also linked in the repository, has a really good documentation for how to install Python Poetry. It's really easy. You just need to have one single command in the terminal. Once it's installed, you can go to any directory and type poetry in it, and it will initialize a Python Poetry project. What does this mean? This means for now only that a single file is being created. This file is called pyproject.toml, which is simply a configuration file that specifies all the software that you use for your project and the specific versions of the software. So all the dependencies that you need for your analysis. And once you type poetry in it, it will guide you through a process that creates this file in which you can specify a name for your package or your project. It suggests typically the name of the directory that you're in, a version. You can describe your project briefly. You can provide information on the author, in this case, me. You can specify a license to use for your project, and then you can specify a Python version. So I'm saying here, because I use Python 3.9.5, that this project requires at least Python 3.9. This at least is indicated by this up pointing arrow. And once you've entered this basic information, Python Poetry tells you that you can also specify specific software dependencies. So here you can specify the specific versions of all other packages that you're using for your analysis. And it gives you a variety of options of how you can specify package versions or software dependencies. You can just have a name for something, for example, this NumPy, which is a Python numerical computing package, or you can have a constraint for a specific version, for example, NumPy at and then some version. Here, the constraint is indicated by typing the package name at and then the specific version. You can also include even GitHub URL links or URLs to GitHub repositories or local file projects or any other kind of URL on the internet, as you see here. I'm just going to use standard packages that are available through pip. So I can just say, okay, I type the package name and then the version dependency here, NumPy at 1.21.1. And then I do this for all the packages that I want to use. Here also pandas, scikit-learn, seaborn, and map.lib. And once I'm done, this dialog simply shows me how this PyProject.tml file will look like. It's a very simple text file, which you see here depicted in white, the white text, which contains a few sections. One shows you the basic information about your project, which you entered in the beginning. So including the name of your project, the versions, a description of your project you entered, who's the author, what is the license. Then you have a section that describes all the main dependencies. So these are dependencies that will be installed whenever someone is recreating your environment. So you have a specific Python version, and then all the other specific versions that you entered of the software that you're using. And then this file also includes a brief section that specifies the specific version of Python poetry that was used to create this file. Because Python poetry might also change over time, it's important that Python poetry knows itself which version was used to reproduce this environment. This will, as I said, simply create a file that can live in your directory next to the Readme file, which you can upload to GitHub, for example, and which someone else can then download to reproduce your environment. So how would this reproducing part look like? So how can you reproduce an environment when you get this file from a repository? You simply go to this directory, this repository in your computer once you cloned it, and you type poetry install. This will tell you a bit more about how Python poetry works. So what it does actually, it creates in the background a virtual environment, which is a directory, which is here located on my machine under users Thomas library caches PyPoetry virtual ends. And then you see also the name of the specific virtual environment, which is here indicated in blue. And then it goes ahead, it resolves all the dependencies just to make sure that all the versions that you entered that are provided by the file are matching with one another, are compatible, and then it installs all the dependencies to this directory. You will also see then that another file pops up in your directory, which is the poetry.log file. This is a file that provides even more detail about the specific versions that were actually installed in your machine. So you again have basic information about packages, versions, name, description, but then you also have details about the specific install files that were used for installing these packages on your machine. And then you can just simply have these two files on your machine and upload them and share them with your repository. And this is going to make it really easy for someone else to reproduce your virtual environment. A brief note on how to run scripts in Poetry. You can simply activate an interactive shell in your virtual environment by typing poetry shell in your directory. So then Poetry will look at the configuration file and activate your environment and run your shell in this environment. Or you can run specific files in this virtual environment by typing poetry run and then whatever command you use to run your script. In this case, poetry run, and then I would run a Python script by typing Python scripts and then the name of my script. So once you have made your code understandable, you provide information about how to recreate your virtual environment, you can also give other people more details about the individual computational steps and the sequence of the computational steps that you did in order to achieve your results. So you can automate your analysis somehow so that others can see exactly at what point of your pipeline did you do which computation. And there are multiple ways of automating your analysis process. Two of them I will talk about today, but there are also many more. A very simple one is you just create kind of a meta script, a bash script that calls your individual scripts from the scripts directory in the sequence that they should be executed. Here I would, in the first command, which you see here in the first red marking, I would call the load data script in bash typing python load data.py and then providing all the input arguments. In the second command, I would call the second script, and the third script, I would call the third script. On the one hand side, it allows someone else to reproduce our entire analysis pipeline by calling this run analysis script. But on the other hand, it also allows someone else to look at this file and see, okay, this is the sequence of computations that happened in order to obtain the results that are shown. You could then run the script, again in poetry by typing poetry run, and then your bash for the script name. And you could place the script in your scripts directory. Another common way of doing this, which comes more from computer science, is to create a Makefile. And a Makefile at first looks very complicated, but it's actually relatively simple to understand. So you specify targets in your Makefile, which can then be called by make and then the name of the target in your terminal. For example, we could have a target which is called all. And this target would depend or like have the following subcomputations, which are here load, evaluate, and plot. And then we would specify these individual subtargets that are called by all further down in the Makefile. So we, for example, say load outputs a file that is our handwritten digits data set in the data directory. And in order to create this file in this directory, we need the script load data in scripts. And then we would simply call the script. And then we do this for each other component of the Makefile. Again, you can look at all these files online in the repository if you want, just to give you an idea of how things work. And you can then later on in the terminal, simply in your directory, make it something that is readily installed. You can type poetry run, make, and then whatever target you want to use here. Load, for example, would only reproduce the load command, so what is here marked in red, of the Makefile. So if we type it, we see that the only thing that happens is that the data directory is created and the scripts load data is executed. So you see a printout of all the individual commands here. And the Makefile again can live in your repository, and you can share it with others through GitHub. And this brings me also to the last part of my talk, which is just briefly trying to explain how you can actually share your code with Git and GitHub. So Git is a system for version control, whereas GitHub is a provider for hosting Git repositories online, so that they're available to others. What I mean by version control simply means it's a system that allows you to track changes in your files. Let's say this is your directory, you have a Readme file, and you make a change to this Readme file, and Git provides a way of tracking these kinds of changes where you can say, okay, at this point in time, this change happened, and you give a brief description of this change. On the other hand, Git also allows you to synchronize repositories across machines. So you can, for example, have a clone of your repository from your local computer to some online server, for example, on GitHub. So GitHub is a provider for these kinds of repositories. There's some background information of how Git works. And yeah, I think this is always good to cover because it can be very confusing at first, the structure of Git. So what Git does, it kind of divides your directory on your computer in 3 different areas. There's a working directory, which is the directory that you actually interact with. So these are the files that you see on your machine when you go to your directory. And you see the files, you look at the files, these are the files that are in your working directory. Then there's a staging area and a repository area, which are in the background, which you don't directly interact with. What you can do is then you can, when a change happens in your working directory, Git notifies you that some file has changed, and you can then move this change to what is called the staging area. The staging area is basically an area where you can collect different changes to different files. So you can say, for example, okay, I want to make a change to my repository, and this change will include a change to Readme file, but also to my source code. And once you've collected all the file changes that you want to add to this commit, to which you want to commit in this change of your repository, you can commit them with git commit to your repository, and then you can synchronize your repository with the remote version of your repository through git push. So you push all changes from local to remote, and you pull from, and git pull allows you to pull any changes that might happen on remote to your machine. So if you work with other people, for example, and someone else makes a change to the project, Git pull allows you to get this change to your computer. So to share your code with Git and GitHub, what you want to do is you first want to go to github.com, you log in, and you want to create a repository. You would see an interface that looks a bit like this. And by typing here on new, you get the following form, which allows you to set up a new repository where you specify a name, here reproducible modeling. You give a description of this project. You specify whether it's public or private, for example, and you ask whether you want to add Readme files and a license. So GitHub provides a bunch of default licenses, and you can just choose one, then it's added to your repository. At first, your repository looks like this. It's empty. There are only two files, a Readme file and a license file. And what you want to do is you want to clone this repository to your local machine by clicking on code, copy the link file, and then using this file, this link that you just copied from the online interface, to going to your terminal, going to whatever directory you want to use for your project, and then typing git clone. So git commands are always preceded by git. So git clone means clone this link, this repository that's located in this link to my local machine. We see files are being downloaded, and then the repository is there. We can enter the repository. And one way of checking at the status of your repository is typing git status. And then you see whether there are any changes in your repository when compared to the remote version of your repository, for example. We see everything's up to date because we just downloaded the files, so nothing happened. In this case here, I'm just simply copying all my analysis files for demonstration purposes from another directory. So I've pre-written them, and once I put them all in this directory, Git tells me, okay, there are a bunch of new files, and these files are untracked. They're not part of your repository yet. Do you want to add them, for example? And here you see all the added files in red. I can then add them to my repository simply by typing git add, and then here -A. This is typically not recommended, I would say. I'm only doing this here because I'm copying all the files from one directory to another. Conventionally, you would use Git from the beginning of your project and kind of track all the changes that you're making to your code. You add individual changes to your staging area by typing git add, and then the individual name of your file in which you want to track or add the change to the staging area. Once you've collected all the changes, you can specify a commit message, which is simply a brief description of the change you're making to your repository. It is good practice to use very informative and concise commit messages, so you can later reconstruct at what point in time which change happened to my code. And this is especially useful when you work with other people on larger projects, so they can see, okay, what are you actually changing in the code without having to dig into every file and double checking what's actually happening. We see all the files are added, and then we can simply push them to the remote by typing git push. Everything is being uploaded. When we then type git status again, we see that we are up to date. And there's no difference between our remote and local. And then when we go back to GitHub, we see, okay, actually our files are online. There's a Readme file, all the analysis files are there, the results are there, and our project can now be downloaded and used by other people. So to sum up, what we can do to improve the computational reproducibility of our project is we can organize and document our project well. We can share our virtual environment that allows others to use the exact same versions of software. We can automate our analysis so that others can run our analysis in a single command. We can track and share our code with Git and GitHub. Yeah, that's it. Thank you for listening and for being here.
Great, thank you, Armin. That was really interesting. So shall we open it up for questions at this point?
Yep, sounds good. Maybe I can start with one, which is, Armin, how do you think about this issue of varying random seeds and looking at variability in the results for analyses that are highly computationally intensive, where it might cost $1,000 of compute to run it each time?
Yeah, I think this is this is a really important problem. I think this is something that is being tackled right now also in machine learning research and deep learning research. And I think the general recommendation is that you should run as many fitting runs as you can with your computational budget. So try to account for as many factors of your pipeline as you can, given the computational budget that you have. And one strategy, for example, that is recommended in complex pipeline is that you first run your hyperparameter optimization, your cross-validation procedure. You choose a set of hyperparameters, and then you run a few additional fitting runs where you randomize all the random aspects of your pipeline to account for the influence of this randomness on your script.
Cool, thanks.
Okay, so how does should I read out the questions?
Yeah, go ahead and read them out.
Okay, so we have one question from Joyce Wang, which asks, how does the environment control you described here relate to Docker? So Docker is actually one step further, where you ship an entire container that has all the versions, or that installs all the versions in a totally different kind of like virtual machine, almost virtual machine. Whereas Python Poetry here is something that is a bit more, is actually just like a separate directory in your computer. So Docker is like the next level of like making it even more reproducible. And I thought about talking about today, but I didn't do it. But if you know Docker, it's for sure best practice. It's just, I think, a bit more difficult to explain for a wide audience.
Yeah, the one, just an added comment. I mean, the one place where this might make a difference is, people have shown recently that there are certain cases where the version of various like operating system libraries like glibc can actually cause differences in results, and that's something that would be controlled by Docker, but not by your Python library.
Yeah. So I think like Docker or Singularity are like kind of a gold standard, but they are a bit more advanced.
Yep.
So the second question comes from Brandon. How do you find that Poetry compares to using setup.py in terms of preparing a reproducible Python project? So that is a good question. I think they're very similar. I think Python Poetry is a bit more easy to use and also has some extra more easy to use functionality for adding dependencies of specific software versions to your project. But if you know setup.py is also not a bad way of doing it, because setup.py also can run with pip, and I think Python Poetry also uses pip in the background. So also good. It's also just, again, you need to know a bit more about setup.py, know how to use it. I hope if you have the feeling I didn't answer your questions, please let us know in the Q&A also, if you want to hear more.
So I don't know if you see there's another question in the Q&A.
So I'm using 3.9 here because it's just an example project, and I'm just using very few software packages, and these are all up to date with 3.9. Of course, 3.6 is also a good choice for your project, Python 3.6. Yeah,
do you have a philosophy about, like, should you always use the newest one, or should you be a few back so that other things can be compatible? How do you think about that?
I think I usually use a few back versions. If I would have a more complicated project, I would also use 3.6. But if I do a toy example for a course, then it allows me to do something very simple, and I can use a more recent Python version, just because otherwise I don't have a chance to use this more recent Python version. So
right,
yeah, this was more for exemplary purposes today. So, okay, another question, how I don't do modeling, so this may be naive, but how do people select hyperparameters in the end? Just the ones with the highest accuracy with enough runs? How do you select the best number of runs? So there are a lot of ways of optimizing hyperparameters. Some are a grid search, where you actually specify, okay, these are the individual combinations of hyperparameters that you want to evaluate. There are also more advanced ways of doing this with gradient descent kind of algorithms or Bayesian optimization. And yes, typically you have some criterion that you specify, which you're trying to optimize also with gradient descent. This can be accuracy in a test data set. This can also be something else. So you select the criterion for these are the best parameters this is how you define the best parameters for your model, for your learning process. And then given whatever optimization process you use, you try to find the optimum of these parameters. whatever the most important thing that I want to make is the point that I want to make is whatever scheme you're using for optimizing hyperparameters, just be as transparent as possible about this process. Report how many model fitting runs you computed and what the results of these fitting runs were, just to give people insight into what actually happened under the hood. Because oftentimes you have the feeling papers are written that it seems like everything just worked right from the get-go, and people don't talk about the fact that they actually ran like thousands of fitting runs in the background to find like the best random seed for their project or the best weight initialization, like all these kind of things. So the best way of augmenting data or performing dropout, all these kind of random factors in the training. So just be transparent about this, whatever you're doing. Cool.
Awesome. Well, I guess thanks very much for this this really nice talk, and it will be online at some point in the next week or two, so that anybody who wants to go back and sort of have another look can do that. And otherwise, we will see you next week. I think next week we have reproducible manuscripts with Mike Frank, so that should be fun. And thanks everybody for joining.